Most people are very familiar with the Dyatlov Pass incident, where a group of extremely skilled hikers were found deceased under very mysterious circumstances on the slopes of the Ural Mountains in western Russia. Speculation as to the cause of this tragedy places the blame on the Yeti, the distant cousin of the more well-known Bigfoot that roams the forests of Alaska and North America. However, in a much more recent incident during the latter part of autumn in 2002, in the desolate regions of Siberia, a group of Russian soldiers were attacked more than once by what they insisted was a Yeti. This is their story. The Altai Mountains, a remote and rugged expanse in southern Siberia, are a place where the wilderness reigns supreme. The mountains stand tall, their peaks often shrouded in mist, while dense forests cover the lower slopes, a labyrinth of pine and birch that hides countless secrets. The air is crisp, biting with the chill of Siberia's harsh winters, and the only sounds are usually confined to the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of an eagle soaring high above. This is the setting for the small Russian border patrol outpost, perched on the edge of civilization and the unknown. The outpost itself is modest, a collection of weathered wooden buildings, their walls stained by years of exposure to the elements. Inside, the patrol guards lead a life of routine and discipline, their days filled with the monotony of military drills, equipment checks, and the occasional patrol into the surrounding wilderness. The isolation of the place is palpable, constantly driving home the fact that whoever finds themselves there is far from the comforts of home, surrounded by an untamed and unforgiving landscape. At the time of the incident in autumn 2002, Sergeant Ivanov, a grizzled veteran of the Russian military, had been stationed at the outpost for nearly a year. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, have seen much in his time, but even he couldn't shake the unease that had settled over the camp in recent weeks. It's the little things that had him on edge, the strange noises at night, the unexplained movement in the forest just beyond the fence, and the way the animals seem more restless than usual. He never voiced his concerns to the men. They had enough to worry about without adding tales of the supernatural to their list of troubles. Private Petrov, one of the younger guards, was less restrained in his fears. He talked often of the local legends, the stories of the snowman or Yeti that the indigenous people speak of in hushed tones. The creature is said to be a giant hairy beast, more ape than man, that roams the mountains in search of food or perhaps something more sinister. Petrov's fears were met with laughter and jeers from the other men, but even they had an underlying tension in their voices, a hint that they, too, wondered if there's some truth to the old stories. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, the feeling of dread only intensified. The forest, once a place of relative peace, now seemed to close in around the outpost, its shadows deeper and more menacing. The guards found themselves glancing over their shoulders more often, their hands hovering near their weapons even when off duty. It's as if they were being watched, though by what, they couldn't say. The atmosphere was charged with a nervous energy, a collective anxiety that hung over the outpost like a storm cloud waiting to burst. And all the while, the mountains loomed in the distance, silent and inscrutable, keeping their secrets close. The guards were on edge, but they were soldiers, trained to face danger head-on. What they did not know is that the danger they sensed was far more real than any of them could have imagined. The cold Siberian morning began like any other, the sun barely peeking over the horizon as the guards prepared for another routine patrol. Sergeant Ivanov, ever the disciplined leader, led his men through their morning exercises, his sharp voice cutting through the frigid air. The men, clad in thick, insulated uniforms, moved with the precision that only military training could instill. But there was a tension beneath the surface, a tension that had been building for weeks. As the patrol set out into the forest, the atmosphere was unusually quiet. The only sounds were the crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional creak of branches weighed down by frost. For some reason they could not explain, the forest felt strangely alien, as if the very trees were watching them. Private Petrov, at the rear of the group, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He scanned the dense undergrowth, his breath visible in the cold air, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The patrol followed a familiar path, winding through the trees toward a small clearing they had visited many times before. It was a place they often used as a rest stop, a brief reprieve from the oppressive stillness of the forest. But today, as they approached the clearing, Sergeant Ivanov raised his hand, signaling the men to stop. He had spotted something unusual, tracks in the snow, larger than any he had seen before. The men gathered around the tracks, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The footprints were massive, easily twice the size of a human's, with deep impressions that suggested a creature of considerable weight. The shape of the prints were also strange, resembling a giant elongated foot with long toes. Ivanov knelt down to examine the tracks more closely, his mind racing with possibilities. These were not the tracks of any animal he was familiar with. As the men whispered among themselves, Petrov's voice cut through the murmurs. "It's the Yeti," he said, his voice trembling slightly. The others laughed, but it was a nervous laughter, and no one outright dismissed the idea. The tracks were fresh, meaning whatever had made them was still nearby. Ivanov ordered the men to spread out and search the area, their weapons at the ready. They moved cautiously through the trees, their senses heightened, every sound amplified by the silence. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees towering above like silent sentinels. Petrov stayed close to Ivanov, his eyes darting in every direction, his grip on his rifle tight. The tracks led deeper into the forest, toward a part of the woods they rarely ventured into, a place where the trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. Then suddenly a rustling in the bushes ahead caught Ivanov's attention. He motioned for the men to stop, his heart pounding in his chest. The rustling grew louder, closer, until finally, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was large, covered in thick, matted fur, and walked on two legs, though hunched over like an ape. Its eyes glowed with an eerie red light, reflecting the fear in the men's faces. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The creature, easily over 2 meters or 7 feet tall, stared at the patrol with a mixture of curiosity and menace. Its breath came out in visible puffs, the sound of it heavy in the cold air. Ivanov's mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing, but there was no time for rational thought. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that reverberated through the trees and sent a shiver down the spines of every man present. Without warning, the creature lunged at them, moving with a speed that defied its size. The men scattered, instinct taking over as they fired their weapons in a panic. The sound of gunfire echoed through the forest, but the creature seemed unfazed, swatting at the bullets as if they were mere insects. Ivanov shouted orders, trying to regain control of the situation, but the creature's sheer ferocity overwhelmed them. Petrov, frozen in fear, watched as the creature tore through the patrol with terrifying strength. 2 of the men were thrown aside like rag dolls, their bodies hitting the ground with sickening thuds. Ivanov, seeing his men in danger, charged at the creature, firing his rifle at point-blank range. The bullets struck the creature, but it barely flinched, its focus now entirely on the sergeant. With a roar, the creature swung a massive arm at Ivanov, knocking him to the ground. The force of the blow left him dazed, the world spinning around him as he struggled to get back on his feet. The creature loomed over him, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intent. Just as it seemed ready to strike the final blow, a loud crack echoed through the forest, a tree branch breaking under the weight of snow. The sound startled the creature, and it hesitated, its gaze shifting toward the source of the noise. Taking advantage of the distraction, one of the other men fired a flare into the sky, the bright light illuminating the dark forest. The creature snarled, recoiling from the sudden brightness, and with a final guttural growl, it turned and fled into the woods, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. The patrol was left in stunned silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Ivanov, still on the ground, slowly pulled himself up, his body aching from the encounter. The men gathered around him, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. They had all seen it, the creature that was supposed to be nothing more than a myth, a legend told to frighten children. But it was real, and it had nearly killed them. The outpost was a place of grim silence in the days following the encounter. The men were shaken, their confidence shattered by the reality of what they had faced. Rumors spread quickly through the ranks, each story more exaggerated than the last. But at the core of every tale was the same terrifying truth. They had encountered a creature that defied all logic, a beast that should not exist. Sergeant Ivanov, ever the stoic leader, tried to maintain order, but he too was haunted by the memory of those glowing red eyes. He spent hours reviewing the events in his mind, searching for a rational explanation, but there was none to be found. The creature had left behind little evidence, some tracks in the snow, a clump of fur caught on a broken branch, and a few deep claw marks on the bark of a tree. The injuries sustained by the 2 guards were minor, bruises, a few deep scratches, but the psychological wounds ran much deeper. Nightmares plagued their sleep, and even the bravest among them found it difficult to venture outside the outpost's perimeter after dark. The sense of security they once had, the belief that they were the masters of this remote land, was gone. The atmosphere within the outpost grew tense, the men snapping at each other over trivial matters. Petrov, who had been the first to speak of the Yeti, was now ostracized by some of his comrades, blamed for bringing the creature's wrath upon them. But Petrov remained resolute. insisting that they had encountered the legendary Yeti, the snowman of Siberia, a creature known in local folklore for its strength and ferocity. Ivanov, despite his own doubts, couldn't dismiss Petrov's claims entirely. The creature they had seen didn't match the behavior of any known animal. It had been intelligent, calculating even in its attack, targeting the guards with a precision that was almost human. And those eyes, those intense red eyes, were unlike anything he had ever seen in the wild. As the days passed, the outpost received word from higher authorities that an official investigation would be conducted. A team of military investigators and scientists would be arriving to assess the situation, a development that brought little comfort to the men. They knew that whatever conclusions the investigation reached, it would do little to change the reality of what they had experienced. But then, the night before the investigation team was due to arrive, the creature returned. It was late, the outpost shrouded in darkness, with only the faint light of the moon breaking through the clouds. Most of the men were asleep, except for the night watch, who huddled around a small fire, their rifles close at hand. The quiet was oppressive, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. Petrov was among those on watch, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. His hand rested on his rifle, his knuckles white with tension. Then a loud crash echoed through the night, followed by the sound of splintering wood. The men leaped to their feet, their weapons at the ready, as the door to one of the outbuildings was torn off its hinges and thrown to the ground. The creature stood in the doorway, its massive form silhouetted against the moonlit sky. It was even larger than they remembered, its fur matted and covered in snow, its eyes glowing eerily red as they reflected the light cast towards the woods from the outpost's floodlights. Without hesitation, the men opened fire, their bullets tearing through the night. But the creature was undeterred. It charged at them, its powerful limbs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. The men scattered, but the creature was relentless, swatting aside one man with a single blow, sending him crashing into the snow. Ivanov emerged from the main building, his rifle at the ready, and fired a volley of shots at the creature's back. The bullets struck, but the creature barely seemed to notice. It turned toward Ivanov, its eyes locking onto him with a look of pure rage. Ivanov stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. The creature roared, a sound that shook the very ground beneath his feet, and charged. Ivanov fired again, aiming for the creature's head, but it was too fast. The creature slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. The impact drove the air from his lungs, and for a moment everything went black. When Ivanov came to, the creature was gone. The outpost was in chaos, the buildings damaged, the men dazed and injured. The creature had vanished into the night, leaving behind only destruction and fear. Ivanov struggled to his feet, his body aching, and surveyed the damage. The outpost was barely holding together, and the men were shaken to their core. When the investigation team arrived the next morning, the atmosphere was thick with unease. The team, composed of military personnel and scientists, was led by Captain Volkov, a stern man with little patience for the supernatural. He had been briefed on the situation, but remained skeptical of the men's accounts. To him, the idea of a Yeti was absurd, a relic of folklore that had no place in a modern military operation. The scientists, on the other hand, were intrigued by the reports. They were experts in the field of cryptozoology, a branch of science dedicated to the study of creatures whose existence had yet to be proven. They had come prepared with equipment to take samples and analyze any evidence left behind by the creature. However, their academic interest was tempered by a sense of caution, as they had heard the stories of what had happened. The team set to work immediately, inspecting the damage to the outpost and collecting samples of fur and blood found on the broken door. The scientists examined the tracks left behind by the creature, noting their size and depth. They also studied the claw marks on the trees and the remnants of the makeshift barricades the men had erected in a desperate attempt to keep the creature out. The guards watched the investigation with a mix of hope and fear. They wanted answers, but they also dreaded what those answers might reveal. They had seen the creature with their own eyes, felt its power, and heard its terrifying roar. They knew it was real, but they feared that the investigation would only serve to dismiss their experience, reducing it to a footnote in a report. Captain Volkov interviewed the guards one by one, taking detailed notes on their accounts. He was a man of few words, his questions direct and to the point. He listened carefully to their descriptions of the creature, its size, its fur, its glowing red eyes. He asked about the attack, the injuries sustained, and the measures taken to defend the outpost. But his expression remained neutral, giving no indication of what he believed. The scientists, meanwhile, conducted their own analysis. They compared the fur samples to known species, ran tests on the blood, and examined the tracks in detail. They consulted with local experts on the indigenous wildlife and even spoke to the local people, who confirmed that stories of the Yeti had been passed down for generations. As the investigation progressed, tensions within the outpost grew. The guards were frustrated by the lack of concrete answers, and their distrust of the scientists and Captain Volkov only deepened. Petrov, in particular, felt vindicated by the investigation, even as it became clear that the official report would likely dismiss the idea of a Yeti in favor of a more conventional explanation. The investigation dragged on for several days, with little new information coming to light. The scientists were unable to conclusively identify the creature, and the military investigators were focused on the practicalities of reinforcing the outpost and ensuring the safety of the guards. In the end, the official report concluded that the creature was most likely a bear, possibly rabid, driven to attack by hunger or disease. In the aftermath of the investigation, the outpost was repaired, its defenses strengthened, and the men returned to their duties. But the camaraderie they had once shared was strained, the bond between them weakened by the fear that had gripped their hearts. They were no longer just soldiers, they were survivors, united by the knowledge that they had faced something beyond the understanding of the world outside. Captain Volkov's final report to his superiors was clinical, devoid of emotion. It detailed the attack, the injuries sustained, and the measures taken to secure the outpost. It mentioned the strange tracks and the fur samples, but concluded that the creature was likely a misidentified bear. There was no mention of the red eyes, the intelligence in its movements, or the terror it had inspired in the men. The Yeti, as far as the official record was concerned, did not exist. The Siberian winter had fully settled in by the time the investigation team left the outpost. The snow was thick on the ground, and the cold was a constant presence, seeping into the bones of the men who remained. The world outside was a frozen wasteland, silent and still. But within the hearts of the guards, a storm raged. The Yeti had become more than just a creature. It was a specter that haunted their every waking moment and stalked their dreams. They saw its red eyes in the darkness, heard its growls in the wind, and felt its presence in every shadow. The fear was not just of the Yeti itself, but of what it represented. The unknown, the untamable, the uncontrollable forces of nature that lay beyond the reach of human understanding. Sergeant Ivanov, who had faced the creature head-on, was the most affected. The attack had left physical scars, but it was the psychological wounds that ran deepest. He found himself questioning everything he had believed about the world and his place in it. The military had trained him to be strong, to face danger without flinching, but nothing had prepared him for this. The Yeti had shown him that there were things in the world that could not be fought with bullets or bravery. Petrov, who had always believed in the Yeti, was vindicated but not comforted. The encounter had confirmed his worst fears, and he found little satisfaction in being right. The Yeti was real, but that reality was more terrifying than any legend. He knew that they had been lucky to survive, and he prayed that the creature would never return. As the winter wore on, the men did their best to carry on, to rebuild the routines that had been shattered by the attack. But the memory of the Yeti lingered, a dark cloud that hung over the outpost. They had faced something that defied explanation, and the experience had changed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. The Altai Mountains loomed over them, silent and imposing, a reminder that the wilderness was not a place for men to conquer. The Yeti was out there, somewhere in the frozen expanse, watching and waiting. The men of the outpost knew that they would never truly be safe, that the Yeti would always be a part of their lives, a shadow that followed them wherever they went. In the end, the outpost was just a dot on the map, a place where men had lived and died, fought and survived. But for those who had faced the Yeti, it was much more. It was a place where the line between myth and reality had blurred, where they had glimpsed the true power of nature, and where they had learned that some things could not be tamed. And in the darkness of the forest, the Yeti waited, a part of the wilderness, a part of the legend, and a part of them. So, what's your opinion on what these Russian soldiers encountered? Do you think that what they saw was real and the Russian government merely covered it up? Or do you think these Russians had too much vodka at their disposal? Please share your views in the comments below, and please don't hold back. And remember, liking this video may not give you superpowers, but it'll definitely make our day. And while you are at it, subscribe to the channel, or else you risk missing out on more mindless entertainment like this. Much love and see you next time.